I wanted to start by, in essence, taking a measure of issue with the topic. In my view, it isn't a binary choice, and I don't actually think there's any dilemma at all, really, to be found in relation to public policy between growth and no growth, or between whether we can live with it and whether we can't live with it. And I take essentially 4 objections, in particular to the second part of the title about whether or not we can live with growth. And those objections go to a couple of things. The first is, well, what in the end is the alternative? If you think about it, the alternative to growth, if you think about it, there are 3 sorts of economic systems. There are those in decline, where they're using up more than what their outputs are. There are those that are in some form of stasis, where exactly the same is produced as is used up. And there are those that grow, where more is produced each period than is used up. This is real productivity growth. Now, in my view, the only sorts of economic systems that are remotely interesting are those that grow. And that's for a couple of reasons. The first is, of course, that declining systems eventually die out, and that in relation to systems in stasis, nothing actually changes. And when you think about the effect that that has on ordinary working people, that means that there is no social mobility, and there's effectively no better future for anybody involved. So, in my view, we need to be entirely focused on having an economy and a system that is in growth. If you think about why that's important, you think about all of the things that generally accompany an economy which is sclerotic and an economy which is characterised by being, on a systemic basis, having low growth. Much has been made recently of the fact that Australia's had 21 consecutive years of economic growth, and the global comparisons that Cheryl talked about by the Treasurer and others. I actually wanted to take you back a little bit further than that, to what I think is actually the genesis of that period of growth. And that is the condition that Australia was in the early part of the 1980s, and in particular the recession that occurred around 1981, 1982. The Australian economy at the time was characterised by low growth, low investment, low profits, falling real wages, high inflation, high interest rates, high unemployment, and a protected economy. In 1981, we had business interest rates of 41%, we had inflation of about 12%, unemployment of about 11%, wages were rising by about 12%, and we had about 1.4% growth. We also had essentially a system where tax avoidance was a way of life for those that were wealthy, an economy where 3 in 10 kids finished high school without a proper system of universal public health insurance, and in which 20% of private sector workers had any form of private pension. Now, compare that even to the 1986 period when John Howard was elected. Even at that point, going into the period when the boom really commenced, Australia had the highest growth and the lowest inflation in the developed world. Real wages were growing, 8 in 10 kids finished high school. There'd been a massive expansion of access to tertiary education. We had a universal superannuation system, and we had Medicare. Fast forward to the final results for fiscal 11-12, and we had growth of 3.4%, unemployment of 5%, wages growth of 3.7%, and inflation of 1.4%. That is a much better position for us to be in as a result of the series of changes that were made over that 30-year period. In other words, growth matters, and real people, in my view, suffer if we don't get a growth economy. My second objection is very much taken as a social democrat and as someone who is committed to progressive politics. In my view, growth is even more important for us than it is for people who are Tories. No one, and that's for a very simple reason, no one has yet conceived of a way to secure full employment and to secure rising levels of material prosperity for the majority of people without growth. It simply hasn't been done. Secondly, it's self-evidently easier to redistribute growing national income than it is to redistribute static or falling national income. If you think about it, before the Industrial Revolution, essentially most people in the world between Connemara and Shandong had essentially the same standard of living. And it was the unlocking of growth, particularly around technology, which allowed the enormous rise in material living standards of ordinary people across the globe. My third objection is implicit specifically in the can't live with it message, and I think that has a message around the limits to growth that I don't entirely accept. And this is traversing some of the territory Miriam went to. Of course, as she pointed out, as we get richer, our consumption patterns do change. We tend to use more services and we're less intensive in our resource use. I read recently, and I couldn't find the source looking in last night, but the physical weight of US economic output is now less than it was 50 years ago. I think combined those things suggest that the ecological limits to growth are further away than we generally predict. And I think if you think about some of the histrionic predictions about the limits to growth made in the 1970s, there is some evidence for that proposition. Of course, we do have to have sustainable growth, and we do need to do it in a way, we do need to pay attention to environmental issues and do what we can to help that process, including by doing such things as pricing carbon. My fourth objection is a purely political one. And it's implicit sometimes in the message of the people who suggest there needs to be action taken to limit growth. It's a political objection, it's an ideological objection. And it amounts to this. Many of the people who posit that view, I'd suggest, and this is something of a caricature but not entirely unfair, is the worst sort of bourgeois pull-up-the-ladder politics. It is from people who have a comfortable position in an economy and society which is a leading economy and society in the world, and they say they have a comfortable position both on a global ranking but within their own society, and suggest, well, I'm all right, and so there needs to be limits to growth. To say we don't need growth is to condemn the people, in my view, on the margins of our own society, to say nothing of the world's global poor and the global south, to a life where their living standards do not rise. Poor people in particular do not benefit from an economy which is in stasis. So growth, to my mind, is not just the main game, it's the only game, and I think the seminar title in full, Growth, Wellbeing and Prosperity, is right, but also suggests there are important considerations underlying a growth message which need to be considered. First, we need, of course, to measure growth properly. I agree with the observations Miriam made that we need to measure both the environmental costs of output and growth, not just the output itself. That was as true for pollution in rivers as it is today for pollution in relation to carbon. Secondly, and this is really my main message about what I think the main game for growth is it is in relation to productivity, and that is the key policy challenge we have as a country. To have sustainable economic growth, we actually need sustainable productivity growth. And we care about that as unions because we know it's the only way to increase national income over time, it's the only way to see rising real wages, it's the only way to see rising living standards. But we also care about the distributional gains that are to be made from growth and productivity growth in particular. And what we've seen that while over the course of the 1990s, the gains of productivity growth were roughly evenly shared between labour and capital, in the 2000s in particular, we've seen a decoupling between the labour and capital shares from productivity growth, and the labour share has lagged behind. In other words, the labour share of national income, by whatever measure you choose to look at it, has been falling and is at or very near historic lows over the course of the last 100 years in Australia. So we care about the distributional effects. In 2011, we did a polling experiment replicating some work that was done in the United States about what sort of society Australians thought they had based on inequality of wealth. We got them to draw their prediction of what the Australian wealth quintiles look like, then draw their ideal society, so make a prediction about what we actually look like, draw the ideal, and then of course compared it to the actual. And we got some fairly dramatic results. The first thing is that all Australians, essentially regardless of political affiliation or age or gender, essentially drew a very similar ideal society, and that ideal society was very much more equal than the one that we have, and all people dramatically understated the level of inequality that we have in our society. Poor Australians lacked an insight into just how badly off they were in relative comparison, and rich people underestimated the extent to which they were up the top. The poorest Australians had about 10 times less wealth than people thought they had, and 14 times less than people think they should have. And the wealthiest had nearly twice as much as people thought they had, and 2.5 times more than people thought they should have. Now, inequality matters, and it's actually getting worse in relation to our society. If the incomes if average full-time earnings in Australia had risen at the same pace as the earnings of the top 1% in our community between 1981 and 2008, average full-time incomes would be around about $90,000 a year, not $50,000 a year. So the top is pulling away from the middle, but the middle is also pulling away from the bottom. If the minimum wage had risen over the period 1981 to 2008 by the same rate as average full-time earnings in our economy had risen, the minimum wage would be $350 a week higher than it is now. So the top's pulling away from the middle, and the middle is pulling away inexorably from the top. And inequality matters not just because it's unfair, but we know it has broader and intergenerational effects. We know that rising inequality means worse social mobility over time, and it means people are less likely, people's kids are less likely to do better than they did, which has always been, I think, the aspiration of our society, and I always try and reclaim that word from the right, from the political right, because I think it's our word, aspiration. That's always been a core goal of what we've been trying to do as unions, and I think as people involved in progressive politics, and I think that's why we need to be concerned about inequality. We also need to be concerned about the distributional effects of growth within our own economy and the systematic change which Australia is undergoing. I was struck recently by a chart Mark and Parkinson used to illustrate the change to the Australian economy in the mining boom. And what that showed, that between now and 2050, essentially mining and manufacturing as a proportion of our GDP will do a direct swap between manufacturing going from around about 15% of our economy to around about 7%, and mining and resources going from around about 7 to around about 15%, with services bumping around about the 70% of our economy that it's been for a considerable period. That's the macro effect of the mining boom, but it also illustrates why we need to be concerned not just about headline growth, but about the effect inside the economy. Of course, manufacturing still employs about 5 times as many people as mining. 70% of the economy is services, and yet we've got a mining boom where, in our view, the benefits of that boom are not being shared broadly enough for a variety of reasons. First of all, we were unsuccessful in securing proper charging against non-renewable resources in the form of taxation, as recommended by the Henry Review. Secondly, around about 80% of mining and resources profits are repatriated overseas. Thirdly, the opportunities for employment in that sector are being greatly reduced by not only a mechanisation process, but by the prospects of temporary foreign labour. And those jobs that do exist have serious social consequences in the form of FIFO labour and other things which are seriously disruptive, and not the sort of jobs, if you like, that made up our communities in previous decades. Meanwhile, you have the terms of trade and these other factors driving a high dollar, which is hollowing out and causing serious damage to other productive parts of our economy. So you need to have a holistic conception of growth. We also need to have a tax system which deals with growth and does so in a way that still allows us to have the sort of community that Australians expect. We need a tax system which efficiently raises adequate revenue to meet the needs of the community, but does so in a manner which is consistent with distributional equity. In the context of Australia, I think we face serious issues in relation to that and the operation of our tax system. And Jennifer and I are involved in the Business Tax Working Group for our troubles, where we occasionally cross swords in relation to approaches to business tax. In my view, current claims to significantly reduce the corporate tax burden while simultaneously maintaining distortions and concessions implicit in the system will not help. They will not help us deal with growth, and they will not help us deal with the overall issues we have as a country. The current clamour to shift the tax burden away from corporations onto lower and middle income earners, in particular via a GST, needs to be seriously resisted. The potential effects of potential ongoing effects of the serious disservice that Australia's political class did by hollowing out the upper end of the income tax system in the lead up to the GFC is essentially the core problem that Wayne Swan faces in continuing to try and balance the budget. So I think the tax system is important. Sure, I'm just winding up. Someone warned me in addressing this topic that I was at serious risk of making a discursive soliloquy of great practical irrelevance, and I should be careful. Some of you may have met Grant Belchamber before. So I wanted to finish on that productivity point again, because I really do think it's the main game. We need an economy that is bigger, stronger, but also fairer. And that's what will end up giving us a society which is both stronger and fairer. We need one characterised by rising living standards, rising real incomes, social mobility, and improved education and health outcomes. That's the policy challenge as far as I'm concerned. Real productivity growth that's sustainable on a social and environmental basis. But we won't get that from a race to the bottom. We won't get it from a race to the bottom on wages, on social protection, on working conditions, on tax, or on environmental standards. Instead, Australia needs to take a high road to growth in relation to education, skills, technology, infrastructure, innovation, quality management, and quality governance. Thanks very much.